Great, thank you for that. Now, Britney Spears sang Oops, I Did It Again, and we continue to do this here. We always say we're going to limit the webinar for 1.5 hours, for 2 hours. We stretch it for 2.5, for 3. But when you have such amazing speakers, and they all say yes, and they want to be part of this, you cannot say no. So don't worry if you had to go pick up the child or go and do something, go to a meeting and come back or whatever. It will all be sent to you recorded. You can view it again, and I really think that the next one is something you have to hear. Shadi Abu Zahara is our next speaker. He's an accessibility strategy and technology specialist, W3C Web Accessibility Initiative, WAI, and he's going to share with us what's next on W3C Web Accessibility WCAG. Please, Shadi, looking forward to hearing what you have to share.
Thank you so much. It's so great to be here. I know it's been long, so I will try to hopefully provide some addition after such fantastic speakers. It's good to see friends and colleagues from all around the world and the amazing work that is happening everywhere. This is really great. So we've heard several times today the magic word, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG, WCAG. WCAG, it's pronounced many different ways. What is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines and what's new? And actually, we do have really hot news just off the press. So I hope this will be interesting for you. So the first question I often encounter is, who creates WCAG? Where does this come from? We hear about WCAG and there is this standard WCAG. Well, it's you. You develop contact, you being the community. So W3C standards are developed through an open process where we really invite different stakeholders, industry, disability organizations, governments, research, and many more to participate here, to come together in a consensus-based process. And we respond literally in the development of standards for example, for WCAG, to literally thousands of comments that come from all around the world. We know it's very hard. How do we specify accessibility requirements? Things that we still need to put in, things that don't work quite right. So it's an invitation really here, and I will come back to this at the end of the presentation. It's the open source spirit, it's working together, it's collaborative work to develop not only these standards, but also many, many other resources that we're developing at W3C to hope to make digital accessibility a reality. So let me back up and talk about WCAG 2.0, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.0, which is kind of a milestone standard. It was developed way back in 2008, but it defined really very important principles, the so-called POUR principles, and Rory mentioned that earlier today: perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust, right? These are key principles that help to try to explain accessibility within lots of so-called guidelines below it, 12 guidelines. Under that, 61 success criteria. So it goes into more and more detail that are ordered in 3 conformance levels. Now, one of the important things is before WCAG 2, there were so many different standards, different variations of back then WCAG 1.0. There were many different variations around the world. And that's really a big problem. When we don't have a common standards, we cannot share tools, training, experiences. We cannot build these international programs. We cannot support each other, because if every country is different, the market gets smaller and becomes more expensive for each region to develop its own resources. By bundling the few resources that we have in accessibility and trying to agree on common standard, we really can progress accessibility. And that's one of the key aspects that WCAG 2.0 managed. And it's been adopted as an ISO standard. It's been adopted as a Japanese industry standard in Spain, in Europe, a so-called EN 301549. Lots of names and acronyms here. I'm sorry for the captioners and the sign language interpreters for all these acronyms. So WCAG 2, as I said, is a milestone that has been, is the reference and is the current applicable version in, for example, in the US Section 508, but in many countries around the world. As I mentioned, it's come into the years. So a few years ago in 2018, the W3C issued an update, WCAG 2.1, which addresses things that were not as well addressed in WCAG 2.0. Most importantly, people with cognitive and learning disabilities. This is a really difficult part of accessibility. It's very difficult to define. It's very individual. It's very personalized. But there are also issues with the way that WCAG itself is set up that doesn't make it easy to adopt some of these kind of requirements, some of these user needs. But we've tried to improve some in WCAG 2.1, also some requirements for people with low vision, not necessarily people who are using assistive technology, maybe who are just using increased size, needing reflow, these kinds of aspects. And lastly, one of the things that wasn't as prevalent in 2008 is mobile devices and apps. And so there has been a lot of work in WCAG 2.1. So actually WCAG 2.1 adds 17 success criteria, so 17 additional requirements, but it's fully backwards compatible with WCAG 2.0. So if you meet WCAG 2.1, you automatically meet WCAG 2.0. And this has been adopted also in Europe with the so-called Web Accessibility Directive, references an updated version of the European standards, which includes WCAG 2.1. We are also working on WCAG 2.2. One of the things is we didn't get everything that we wanted to get into WCAG 2.1. So there is some continued work here, but we're expecting this to be wrapped up fairly soon, hopefully by the middle of this year. So this is really coming down your way, an updated version. It adds some more success criteria. It clarifies some things, but most of all, this is one of my pet areas. It looks also more on accessibility conformance testing. There's new work here on accessibility conformance testing. Now, what does that mean? At W3C, we have a list of web accessibility evaluation tools, and listed on them right now is, I think, even beyond 157. I think meanwhile we've exceeded the 160 tools listed in there. There's also many more methodologies, so procedures that people use to do the checking internally in their companies and so on. And one of the issues is the consistency between these tools and methodologies is sometimes different, so we get different results. And again, this is another type of fragmentation. Not that we're using different standards, even when you're using the same standard, if we have different interpretation, this really impedes on accessibility, the same issue. So we want to avoid this fragmentation. So we've taken up work on trying to really define these testing rules, as we call it. These are for automated tools, but also for manual checks. We've been working on this now for the last 3 years. We've produced over 70 rules, of which 12 have been approved, formally approved by W3C. I mentioned earlier that process, this community process and this validation and this rigorous way of working with the community. So only things that really reach a wide consensus and approval is when they get published. So we have 12 such rules published, and you will see them as part of the next WCAG 2.2, the so-called supporting documents. So around the standard itself, there's additional information on how to meet the requirements, so-called techniques and understanding documents. And just new, you'll see that in the next version of WCAG 2.2, there's also the testing rules starting to get integrated here. This will be evolutionary, so we will keep adding more testing rules as we go along. So this is the WCAG 2 series, and so we're not just adding success criteria, well, we are, but we're also trying to add information around it and make it more rich and easier to implement by different developers. But it's really time for something new. WCAG 3.0 is on the horizon, and this is really where there's new information. Just last Thursday, W3C published a so-called first working draft of WCAG 3.0. What does first public working draft means? It means this is just a very, very first, this is like an iterative process, and this is just the very first rough idea by the group, and they're asking for feedback. So we do invite your feedback, your thoughts. What do you think of this? There are many, many new things in this new standard that the working group is trying to achieve. First of all, trying to cover more technologies. We heard about mobile, but there's also more. There's the Internet of Things, all these devices that are being connected. Your toaster talks to your fridge and talks to your pot and talks to your oven, and all these smart homes, for better or worse, right? That's a different discussion. But fact is that there's all these new technologies, all these connected devices, smart homes, smart environments, and that's a huge potential for people with disabilities. At the same time, it's a challenge. It could actually be more exclusionary if we don't make this accessible from the start, right? If we don't have the right interfaces, actually sometimes the old mechanical interfaces are more accessible because you can feel them and you can know the knob, where the knob is. But if the new kind of ways of interacting is not made accessible, this can be a big problem. So we have many more technologies that we need to address as digital technology continues to evolve. Another one is the so-called buzzword XR, for immersive environments. So this could be augmented reality, where you hold up the phone and there is overlays or things like this, where it's mixed between reality and things that are overlaid, augmented, but at the same time also virtual reality, where you're completely in 3D. And we also need to broaden the coverage of accessibility user requirements, so of different kinds of disabilities that we did not address as well in WCAG 2, we're trying to address better in WCAG 3. So it's really a very new approach. I mentioned earlier people with cognitive and learning disabilities as an example, but there are many kinds of disabilities that need special care in terms of how can we define requirements that are flexible enough because they're so individual. I'll give you a specific example. Easy to read. What does it mean, easy to read? What is plain language? How can we define that across different languages? It's quite difficult to actually define that. At the same time, we need some kind of robust mechanism to be able to say, yes, you're now accessible, or no, you need to do more work here. So between these two, of being prescriptive and being flexible, is kind of a very difficult gray area. So this is one of the concepts that the group is trying to address. And there's initial work in this draft that we welcome feedback on. Also, moving away from web pages to so-called tasks. The concept of a web page is really kind of diminishing with all the apps and states and dynamic content and so on. And I think there was a talk earlier today about that, about flows and things like this. And it's again, it sounds very good, but when it comes to the detail, the devil lies in the details, as they say. It's very difficult to define what is a task and what is a process. So this is hot off the press. Really welcome your opinions. As I mentioned earlier, this is all open source. You can get involved, and we want you to get involved. And there are many ways and different levels you can do. First of all, read, use, and promote these resources. Translate them. We welcome translations of all our resources, and we even provide them through our homepage. You can provide feedback and comments. So on most pages, at the bottom, we have a box where you can provide feedback by email, by GitHub, through an online form. For the so-called technical standard, that information is at the very top of the page, how you can provide feedback. And you can actively participate in W3C groups. They're so-called community groups, for example, where the testing work is happening. These are open to everyone, regardless of any W3C membership. And then there are working groups that are really trying to manage these comments and this community process. One last slide, because I know we're tight on time, just a shameless plug, a free online course that we're providing called Foundations of Web Accessibility, or Introduction to Web Accessibility, really provides the basics to understand what is accessibility. You learn about the guidelines, the standards, you learn how to apply it, simple things that you can check by yourself, even if you're a non-technical person. Don't be afraid. Or send it to your colleagues, send it to your organizations. It's fully freely available, and we hope that this will be helping, because one of the things, we speak about all these technical aspects of accessibility. I think Irene mentioned it really, and I think that's a very important point to emphasize. Education, awareness raising, capacity building, and skills. This is really important in the field of accessibility, right? So this course is specifically designed for non-technical people as well. So there's aspect of managing the process and how to include accessibility in your process, the business case, and many other things. You can find all this information and much more, educational and technical resources, including the latest standards that I just mentioned, on our website, w3.org/WAI. And my name is Shadi Abuzara. You can reach me on Twitter at SABOUZAH, or by email shadi, SHADI, at w3.org. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much.